One can say that a myth or a story is the condensation of the wisdom of a particular culture. In a way, it is the dream of a whole society, and one can learn so much about what's going on and what's likely to happen in the next hundreds of years from the mythology which springs up from a people. It's just incredible to understand how we are formed by the mythology which goes on in the back of our head or at the bottom of our soul, so to speak. Our decisions, our choices, our moods, our aspirations, the very reason we live are largely formulated by the mythology which one carries within one. And to know one's myth is really to know oneself, to know one's pattern, to know one's fate. Some incredible mythology surfaced in the 12th century, and there's reason for a good argument that our time, our modern era, began in the 12th century.
This is the story of Parsifal and his search for the Holy Grail, the chalice of the Last Supper. The Holy Grail is kept within a castle. The king of the castle has been wounded severely and suffers greatly. The whole land and all its people are in desolation. The king had been wounded early in his adolescence. While wandering in a forest, he had stolen a salmon roasting on a spit. He burned his fingers horribly, and to assuage the pain, he put his fingers into his mouth and tasted the salmon. At that moment, he was shot through the testicles with an arrow. The wound does not heal. The king lies on a litter and must be carried everywhere. He is only happy when he is fishing, and thus is called the wounded fisher king. He may only be healed if a wholly innocent fool arrives in court and asks the question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" One day, the Fisher King is out in his fishing boat. A young man approaches and asks for a place to stay the night. So the Fisher King invites him to the Grail Castle. The young man is called Parsifal, which means innocent fool. As a boy, Parsifal saw 5 knights ride by on horseback. Dazzled by their armor and their scarlet and gold trappings, he wandered off to join them, dressed in a homespun garment. Parsifal never found those same 5 knights. He encountered the Red Knight from King Arthur's court, and by a fluke of luck killed the Red Knight and took his horse and armor, which he put on over his homespun. Parsifal found his way to the castle of Gornemond, who trained him to be a knight. Gornemond instructed Parsifal to find the Grail Castle and asked the question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" Parsifal enters the Grail Castle with the Fisher King. The drawbridge snaps shut and ticks the back feet of his horse just as he crosses. Parsifal is royally welcomed. A maiden enters with the Grail, and all but the Fisher King drink from it. Everyone watches Parsifal expectantly, but he fails to ask the question. The next morning, Parsifal finds that the Grail Castle and all its people have vanished. 20 years pass, and Parsifal subdues many knights, slays many dragons, and rescues fair damsels. But Parsifal has become very tired of the heroic life of a knight, and one day is confronted by an old hermit who berates him for his sins and that he did not ask the question. The hermit then blesses Parsifal and tells him where to find the Grail Castle again. As Parsifal enters the Grail Castle for the second time, the drawbridge snaps shut and ticks the back feet of his horse. He sees that the Fisher King is still suffering. This time he asks the question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" The answer is given. The Grail serves the Grail King. Not the wounded Fisher King, but the Grail King, who has lived in the central room of the Grail Castle from time immemorial. The Fisher King is healed immediately, and the land and all its people can live in peace and joy.
The story of Parsifal is such a good story because it's such a very human story. The Arthurian tales and the Round Table and the great knights and all the things that they were doing are bigger than life size. But Parsifal is so much a human being, and one can identify easily with him. In 1948 and 9, when I was studying at the Jung Institute in Zurich, in Switzerland, I had a room with a private family. One day they said, "You know, we can't call you Robert. It just doesn't fit. It won't do. Is it all right if we call you Parsifal?" Yes, that's fine. About a week later, Mrs. Jung, who was lecturing on the Grail myth and to whom I'm indebted for most of the information I'm talking about now, announced that the word Parsifal meant innocent fool. So I went home and I said, "I'll bet you don't know what Parsifal means." And they said, "Oh yes, we know." So they had me very well tagged. I've been Parsifal all of my life, as is true of most modern people.
Robert, can you tell us how the Grail legend has affected you in your personal life?
Well, the Grail legend is really my autobiography. It's touched me profoundly. The results of it turned into my first book, He, which is really autobiography, only thinly disguised. It's such a wonderful myth because it's the biography of every modern person who has any contact with his inner world. And according to the story, I blundered into the Grail Castle the first time. That's how it always happens. I was 16 years old. I'd lied about my age and got a job. It was a night job and I couldn't sleep the day before. I was too excited. The job was a terribly hard job. I'd never worked hard physically in my life. It was hard on me and it was very hard on my feet. So I worked all night. I was horrified. I was stricken. I was really just bowled over by the harshness of life and of the adult world, how hard people had to work. The roughness and the rudeness and the impersonality of the big factory where I'd gotten the job. When they finally let me loose about 4 in the morning, there's only one thing in the world I wanted more than a bath and my bed to go back and take care of my bruised and exhausted body. But more than that, I needed to see something beautiful, or my philosophy and view of the world just wouldn't hold up. So I got in my car and drove up to the West Hills of Portland, Oregon, which is where I lived, to watch the sunrise. And that was my first Grail Castle experience. That sun rose in a glory which I've experienced very rarely in my life. This was the first time of it. And curiously, I heard it more than I saw it. I tasted it and I felt it and I heard it and I saw it and I touched it. It was such a profound experience that it touched all of those faculties. It was all the glory of the world wrapped up into one experience. I watched for nearly half an hour, and then my tiredness came back again. I went back to my car. The tire had gone flat. And by the time I changed the tire on the car, I was thoroughly miserable. The vision had gone, and there was just an aching body and exhaustion and despair left in my life. I went home and had my bath and slept the whole day and went back to my job again that night. I kept the job going, but at terrible cost. The chief legacy of that job was that it gave me my first Grail Castle experience. Well, I searched hundreds of times after that. I went to mountaintops to watch sunrises to see if I couldn't find that Grail Castle experience again, but it wouldn't come again. Just as the legend has it, Parsifal doesn't see the Grail again for at least 20 years, closer to 40 for me. I had a lot to do, a lot of growing up to do before I would have the right to see the Grail Castle again. So I searched and looked and studied and poked my head into every conceivable and some inconceivable things, trying to find the Grail Castle again. None of it. Then in my early 50s, remember this is from age 16 now to early 50s, I decided to go off to India. And in an odd kind of a way, I recapitulated the whole experience again, including the exhaustion, because I was in a jet airplane for 24 hours and gone through 13 and a half time zones. I was tired and I was sleepy and I was a little bit scared. I'd never been in India before and I didn't know where to go and I didn't know anybody there. And they'd lost my suitcase, and I went out of the airport, a howling mob of taxi drivers fighting over me. I told them to take me to a Western-style hotel. I got to my room on the top floor of the hotel facing east, just as the light was beginning to come, about 6 a.m. This was January. I stood there after the bellboy left, and I watched the sunrise over the skyline of old Delhi with its minarets and its towers and its Arabian Nights-like things. And when the sun came up, there was the Grail Castle again, the same thing. And just as the myth tells it, the Grail Castle scene goes on every night of your life, just like there's a sunrise every morning of your life. But it takes something special before one can see it. Well, there it was. I was dead with exhaustion, a little bit frightened. But I saw and heard and tasted and felt that sunrise, and it was all the glory of the Grail Castle again. And it never left me entirely after that second time, because I was strong enough and knew enough and had gathered a little bit of wisdom so that I could ask the pertinent question. So there's an example, 20th century, ordinary one-cylinder, two-bit American personality experiencing that old myth in its totality. Those two experiences have been talisman or focal points of my life, and really are the summation of my philosophy, especially since the second time around. And because I knew enough about it, I avoided most of the pitfalls of Grail Castle times, which are sometimes extremely dangerous things to go through. One can inflate horribly, and I had the sense not to try to be the big guy, or start a new sect or a movement, or come back from India, the great teacher, or something like that. One has to be very cautious with Grail Castle times. They're almost totally private experiences, and it's not good to talk much about them, or certainly it's not good to use them as fuel for the fire of one's inflations.
Throughout time, young men have been helped by fathers and father figures. But in this story of Parsifal, he doesn't have a father.
This is really the history of the ego of a modern man. He starts out fatherless, which is true of most of us. We aren't very well fathered, any of us. Fathers are gone most of the time. Our whole industrial world takes fathers away from us. Few boys are around their father during work time. So in essence, we grow up fatherless. We're too much mothered. It's interesting that the people who are strongest in this mystical structure, who are the true Parsifals, are fatherless. They're inadequately fathered, or their father is dead, or father didn't function very well. It's as if they have to go on father themselves, which makes them strong, or can finish them off. That's a dangerous thing. If one does it well, he's likely to get the highest value out of it. But if he doesn't do it well, that drawbridge may knock him off and he becomes a casualty of life.
And with Parsifal, the hero, we have this naive and innocent boy who jumps on a horse, tears down the runway, and kills a red knight, and then becomes a man.
Just for the sake of the story, Parsifal only has an old nag of a horse which couldn't gallop down in any way at first. And he kills the red knight and takes his wonderful black stallion. And that's the one that he gets on and can't stop. That's so amusing, I can scarcely bear that bit because it comes too close to home. What youth hasn't gotten on a black stallion and didn't know what to do with it when he got it going? Every boy turning into a man has to do his red knight battle somewhere, somehow, on some level. Last year in India, I made friends with a fisher village. And the young boys became men the same day that they're capable of paddling a one-man boat out through the surf. And those little slips of kids were out there paddling, putting their whole heart into it. It probably would be 5 years before they'd ever get a boat out through the surf, but they were trying. And they were getting stronger, and waves would batter them back in again, and they'd be dumped up on the shore. But one day, they would paddle a boat out through the surf, and then they were men. That was the initiation rite for them. Now, an introvert, like me, does it very differently. He's not so likely to go out and win a big, showy battle somewhere. He will pursue this whole thing and do exactly the same thing, but in his own introverted way. It will be very private. Probably nobody else will ever see it or ever know it. But he fights some kind of extremely introverted, private, monk-like, monastic battle inside himself, which scarcely would rank as heroism to anybody else's eyes, but it's the introvert's equivalent of it. My harpsichord, which has played a very important part in my life, was part of my red knighting. There's a fantasia and fugue in A minor by Bach, which is a difficult thing to play. And I struggled with that fantasia, I think about as long and as fiercely as those fisher boys did in India to get through that surf. I finally memorized it and could play it tolerably well. That's another form of red knighting.
To continue with Parsifal, he also slays dragons.
In Western psychology, the dragon almost always represents a man's mother complex. And every heroic journey in the West consists in large part of slaying dragons and rescuing fair maidens who have been captured by the dragon. And most young men have to go out and rescue a goodly number of fair damsels in actual physical form. And any girl who is worth her salt knows this about a boy and will arrange incidents for him to rescue her, because he needs to rescue a fair damsel. And she also needs to be rescued. Now, the introvert forms of this are much more solitary, and one is less likely to go out and win fair maiden against terrible competition or awful perils to his life. The introvert will work these things out, again, very privately in those interior struggles. It's just as good to conquer a mother complex in the form of a mood as it is to conquer one's mother complex in a great tournament or ordeal of strength or something like that. The mother complex in a man is that quality which would defeat him. It's his moodiness, it's his defeatist attitude, it's the quitter in a man It's a thing that wants to crawl back into the safety of childhood and be taken care of. As a friend of mine put it, he said, it's that thing in me that wants to pull the covers up over my head when I wake up in the morning and play as if the world isn't there. Every man, whether he be introvert or extrovert, has a big battle with his mother complex. If he loses that battle, he isn't worth his salt the rest of his life.
What is the difference between the Grail Castle and the womb of the mother?
I think the two are practically synonymous, one inside and the other outside. And a boy has to leave his personal mother and his mother complex and that stupid homespun one-piece garment in order to earn the right to the archetypal mother, which is the Grail Castle and the Grail. Which is to say, you have to leave the Garden of Eden before you can get to the heavenly Jerusalem. And it's a hell of a journey in between. The Grail Castle is that visionary, mystical, interior world which is always just down the road and turn left. You always must go left into the unconscious, inward, in order to find the Grail Castle. And it's never far away. That's maddening to a man when he knows that that probably highest value and greatest joy that a human being is capable of is never very far away, just down the road and turn left and go over the drawbridge. But in fact, or in essence, it's not available to one much of the time. That is, if one looks in actual fact for it. If one looks in imaginative fact, it's always nearby. Virtually every man remembers the time when he blundered into the Grail Castle when he was about 16, 15, 17 years of age. And he was there only for a few hours, an ecstatic time when the whole world glowed before him. And then he loses it because he hasn't the equipment for holding it, or he hasn't earned it. Then follows that 20 years or so, and he has a second chance at a conscious visit to the Grail Castle. And not very many men do the second visit. And if they don't, 45 years of age and on is downhill. Like Oscar Wilde once said, from here on down it's uphill all the way. But if one does it right, and he's really been a heroic personality and done his life correctly, he has a second chance at the Grail Castle. And if he will ask the question, then it's his for the rest of his life. And his old age will be a highly creative process then.
If after 20 years a man does reach the Grail, then what would it mean for that man to serve the Grail, to serve God?
Well, it's a whole basic attitude. That word attitude carries a lot of weight for modern people. What is one's attitude? A man can walk from here to there and do something, and another man can walk from here to there and do exactly the same thing. And the two of them have different attitudes or different values in back of it. And that makes a whole difference whether he earns the Grail Castle or misses it. It isn't so much what you do, it's the attitude with which one does it. That is, that old-fashioned, archaic question, whom does the Grail serve? Is it for me? How much money in the bank for me? Or does it serve the life process and our whole cultural or racial place in the world? If you ask any man on the street what he lives for, or what is the meaning of life, or whom does the Grail serve, that would be old-fashioned language for it. Of course he would answer, it's for me. What's in it for me? There's the psychology of virtually every modern man that the Grail serves the ego. It's for me. What's in it for me? And the real answer, if you're in the Grail castle is that the Grail serves God. The Grail serves the Grail King. It serves that which is greater than I. It's that moment, or it's that transition, or it's that evolution which makes a man fit to stay in the Grail castle for the rest of his life then. That's an enormous point of evolution when Parsifal asks the question. Remember, he had only to ask it. He didn't have to be wise enough to answer it. Only ask it. And it was said that the answer went reverberating through the whole Grail castle then. I take an enormous encouragement from the fact that I have only to formulate the question. I don't have to be smart enough to answer it. Somebody has said that it takes 90% of one's energy to formulate the right question and only 10% to answer it. To ask a real question is to be very close to its answer. It was said that when a patient came to Dr. Jung, of course, asked some earth-shaking question which he had come to the analysis for, and Dr. Jung would say, I haven't the foggiest idea. We must look at your dreams. Dr. Jung didn't have the answer. The ego doesn't have the answer. But there is an answer. Go to the Grail castle. I think the Grail castle is another word for the place of imagination or the place of dreams. Remember, this goes on every night of your life. The Grail castle procession goes on every night of one's life in one's dreams. It said in the story that the Grail, the cup, glowed with its own light and filled the whole room with a soft kind of light. I'm fascinated with the symbol of light, two kinds of light. Masculine light, which is sunlight, that clear, straight, penetrating, discriminating, enlightening quality, which masculine light is. And a much softer feminine light, the lumina natura, as the alchemist called it. Light from an oil lamp gives that soft lumina natura quality, which is very feminine. It's still light and it still shows. It still gives the faculty of sight, but it does so in a feminine way, more like the moon than like the sun. And it is that kind of soft, feminine light, sometimes associated with the goddess Sophia, which fills the room that night.
Now, who is this old hermit? Is there an analogy in contemporary times?
The old hermit is that hermit part of you which knows how to be alone. Every character in this story is some part of the individual personality. The old hermit is that fellow in one who likes to go fishing alone on a Saturday afternoon, or just go away and tinker about with anything to keep you occupied, basically while you can be alone. The old hermit is the aloneness, or the high introvert in one. And it's he who can lead you to the Grail castle a second time. The myth is principally in its extroverted form because it is speaking to an extroverted society. So not much mention is made of that extremely introverted quality which the old hermit represents. But he is mentioned and he is there. Small nourishment for the introverts in our society that the myth only speaks for 5 minutes of the old hermit. And that's about the proportion of introversion to extroversion in our society. The hermit part of one is always angry with the extroverted part, which has been busy raising your family and earning your money and building your empire and so forth. And generally the hermit just has to wait for 20 years or so until a fellow's got that all done or disillusioned himself enough so that he isn't interested in it anymore. And then the old hermit can give you absolution. That is the extreme introvert in you. and remind you, just down the road and turn left and over the drawbridge, and there's the Grail Castle again. I've spent much more time with the old hermit, and in a way I've turned into an old hermit. I'm the one who sits quietly here in my cliff house, and people come to talk things over, and I'm leading a much more introverted life than most Westerners do. So I identify profoundly and deeply with the old hermit.
Was Dr. Jung an old hermit for you?
That's true. I've had good luck with good teachers, and the ones I would hear and the ones who are most effective for me are likely to be the high introverts, the old hermits in the world. When I talked with Dr. Jung, we were alone the first meetings. He spoke in my own quiet way, and there were pauses back and forth between us. And I thought, how wonderful, here's somebody like me. Now, maybe I can grow up and be a man of this character. Then when I saw him with other people around in public, he was a very different person. And I was hurt. I felt as if I had been betrayed, and I sat off in the corner and sulked. That man has betrayed me. Then it dawned on me, that man has given me a great gift of love because he has taken on the character that I needed when I needed it. I was so profoundly affected that I swore a holy vow then that if I ever got old and wise, I would try to do that for other people and speak each his language to him.
Robert, could you expand on the meaning of the drawbridge hitting the back of the horse's hoofs?
It's a kind of punctuation, and a dangerous one. There are many casualties at the ticking of the back hooves, and it's a back hoof. It's back there where you're not noticing it. It's something you've gone over and can get you from behind. That horse could be knocked off its feet. The danger is that it is extremely perilous to make the transition from the ordinary world, just the highway out there, and the Grail Castle, which is the timeless world, or it's the mystical, visionary world. And when the drawbridge snaps closed, that means the dividing line between heaven and earth, or the imaginative world, and the secular, everyday world. That's a dangerous moment. If one does it unconsciously, like a youngster, he'll take drugs, or he'll get some new form of meditation, or he's just heard of yoga or something like that. He'll make this transition sort of in an adolescent bravado, and he may end up flat on his face. It's a dangerous moment. India is exquisitely aware of transition points, and virtually every transition that one makes in India is accompanied by ceremony. The great passages of life, like adolescence into manhood, or middle age, or the moment of death, or the wedding ceremony, are highly marked. They're highly differentiated by elaborate ceremonies, even some that has never occurred to me to look at. There are prayers to say when you come in the door of your house at home, because you're leaving the outside, the street, and its appropriate laws, and you're entering your own house, which is a different space. There'll be tulsi leaves pinned over the lintel of the door, and you kick your shoes off before you go in. Such things as that. And even to go from one room in a house to another, Indians are aware of the shift of gears, or the center of gravity changes. And you go from the living room into a bedroom, and you're in a different place. They understand that they're in a different psychology. One has gone across the moat, so to speak, and the drawbridge snaps closed every time you pass something like that. It's a shock to wake up to an alarm clock or the telephone ringing or something, because one doesn't get across that moat and the drawbridge with any kind of dignity or any kind of ceremony. Our society is so poverty-stricken and bankrupt of ceremony now that we go blundering around these different levels and wonder why we get into so many messes.
What happens to a person who touches God?
What an enormous question, good heavens. Fortunately, it's rare. Old societies used to protect people from a contact with God. I think they were pretty wise in their point of view that only a few people could stand the impact of a vision of God. So much of traditional religion consists of protecting people from that numinous experience which would be too big for them. A person who is touched by a vision of God too soon or in a deeper sense than he has the capacity to survive it will be a severely wounded person. Really, that's the Fisher King, the wounded experience. He touches God, he eats the salmon too soon, illegitimately, and suffers a terrible wound from this. The fish has been the symbol of Christ since the very beginning of Christian times. And I think the church, in its very conservative way and its very practical view, would have us take a little bit of the nature of Christ at the altar rail during communion. And we take a little bit of it, and it's handed to us by a priest who mediates it. And there's been a ceremony preceding all of this, and a ceremony succeeding it. And the priest is protected. All these wonderful forms and structures and protections which the church provides for us, those are all ways of touching the salmon or touching the nature of Christ in a safe way. If the church had its way, at least the Catholic Church, it would keep us in that kind of participation mystique, the being close to the nature of Christ, and indeed eating it, but under such cautious and careful circumstances that it doesn't burn us or wound us. All of this implies the role of the priest who makes a way or a bridge or a hinge between this world and the next world. That's the duty of a true priest. It's a wonderful thing to be in the presence of somebody whose consciousness is informed by the visionary world which he has experienced. But that's not very frequent.
Can you say more about the Fisher King?
We're all Fisher Kings today. And I think probably half of the suffering of modern people could be canceled out or alleviated just in one stroke by understanding the nature of that suffering. If we understand that we're Fisher Kings and that we have bitten off the salmon and that this is a noble task and is going to yield a wonderful cultural product, then one doesn't have to be guilty over it anymore. And that's half the suffering canceled out right there. One needn't be frightened or guilty any longer. He still has the suffering in his wounded thigh to cope with, and there's no alleviating that suffering. I think it has to go on until the Parsifal in one is ripened and matured enough so that it will make that active consciousness of asking the question, which will heal the Fisher King. But half of the suffering is alleviated the moment one understands that there's meaning in it. The one unforgivable or unbearable form of suffering is meaninglessness.
Is the woundedness a loss of soul?
Loss of creativity, loss of the generative power. It wounds him not in his head, not in his hands, but in penis or testicles or his ability to create. And men ever since that wound, because it's happened to all of Western man since then, makes a man doubt his creativity or his ability, gives him his sense of inferiority, or makes him question whether he can ever generate or not. It's so interesting to contrast this with the fairy tale to come later on, when it was appropriate, of the handless maiden, because when the woman is wounded in much the same way, her hands are cut off. That's the part of her which is incapacitated or wounded. And when a woman feels inferior, she's frightened of her ability to do anything. She doesn't think she's worth anything. And when a man is overtaken by this kind of inferiority, he doubts his capacity to create. There are dimensions of this that I didn't have any idea of. I had no basis from which to understand it until I got out of the Western world. I was in the Orient. I saw people who were not Fisher King wounded for the first time in my life. And then I began to understand what the wound was. The wound is so ubiquitous with us, the one doesn't know any other condition. But if you get to India, you'll see unwounded people and get some insight and sense of who we are and what we're carrying around with us. I think the Fisher King wound is probably coming to its most extreme form in our own age right now. I think the statistics are now that 10% of the American populace spend some time in a mental institution, full-time patient. That means 1 in 10 of us breaks under the Fisher King wound, breaks to the point of requiring hospitalization. And the other 9/10 of us go around containing our wound and our suffering as best we can. Almost everybody I know is lonely. If you can get a person to talk frankly and freely to you, he will tell you about his hurts, and a great deal of it is his sense of isolation or his sense of aloneness. I asked an Indian friend of mine once, when I got to know him well enough so I thought I could broach the subject, could we talk about loneliness? Because it's been such a difficult issue in my life. Better now, but my earlier life was just consumed with loneliness. And he said, "I'm sorry, Robert, I can't talk to you about loneliness because I've never been lonely in my life." And that was the most eloquent answer he could give. An Indian is not a lonely person, and he does not suffer from isolation. He doesn't solve it, he doesn't have it. It's incredible to go to India and see people with 1/100th of the wealth and the convenience that we have being happier than we are. A kind of existential suffering, as it's called in the West now, not known in traditional India, because they never made the Fisher King wound. They are unwounded people, psychologically speaking. Now, physically, they're in terrible shape. It left me speechless to find out that in an Indian family, everybody knows in what order they will starve to death if food gets scarce. The youngest girl goes first, and they go up the line of girls, and then the youngest boy starves if food is getting more and more scarce. And so it goes. In that dimension, they're in terrible straits. But psychologically, they are unwounded and much happier than we are. They never bit on that stuff of individualism or individuation. That's probably the greatest difference between an Oriental and an Occidental, is that we harbor this concept, for better or for worse, and there's some of both, that I am an individual, I am unique. The moment I say that or adopt that concept, I'm immediately a fisher king with salmon in my mouth and an incurable ache in my groin. We can't banish the fisher king wound, but thank God the myth tells us how we can solve it. And that is by a specific act of consciousness, which I think supersedes the wound with meaning. I think that's the Western path. If we find meaning, that which we found wounding prior to it takes on meaning and is no longer a wound. It's that wonderful moment, and I think the appropriate reaction to it would be to laugh for a week, is that there was nothing wrong in the first place. That it's a great divine drama which is going exactly as it should go. It's so interesting to observe what a Westerner means by individuation and what an Easterner is likely to mean by enlightenment. A Westerner generally implies, though he may use varying language for it, that he brings his individuality or his uniqueness to an absolute pitch. And a Westerner would call that enlightenment. And an Easterner would call enlightenment the extinction of individuality or separateness or uniqueness. If you ask an Eastern teacher, does one still exist after enlightenment? He will ask you, does the dewdrop still exist after it falls back into the ocean? And while you're trying to puzzle that one out, he's gone off to afternoon tea. Of course the dewdrop still exists, but not as a dewdrop anymore. An Easterner likes to temper his idea of the extinction of any personality or individuality by saying that a truly enlightened person is the ultimately compassionate person, which means he is aware of the rest of mankind. Buddha, in his compassion, consented to stay on the face of the earth after his enlightenment and be a teacher, which certainly takes the rest of mankind into consideration. So I think these two things are simply the north and the south path up the mountain to the top, and they arrive at the same place.
One time you said that everyone has a myth. Could you say more about that?
The modern world engages in a terrible heresy. This is the usual psychological point of view these days, that everybody is born a blank page. That is, he's just a ball of putty, and the experiences of life form his character. Well, that's half true, but the other half of it is that every person is born with his own mythology built in. It's almost like his IBM card, which is incorporated in the package and determines so much of the characteristics of his life. It's extremely important for a person to know his own myth, because that dominates so much of the characteristics of that person. To know his myth, to be conscious of it, means that one can cooperate with that myth and do the best possible job with it. It was terribly important in my own life when I decided to honor my own introversion, because I'm way over on the introvert side of the scale. And it was still later that I learned what it meant to be an introverted feeling type. And since that represents only 1% of the populace of America in typology, it's very difficult to hold up under a minority status like that. But I learned what it meant to be an introverted feeling type only after I'd been in India, because that's an introverted feeling society. Living in that land and among those people gave me courage enough and prototype enough so that I could come back here and live my introverted feeling life, which is the only thing that works well for me. And thank God it has worked well. Much of my own mythology, that myth which was incorporated in me at the beginning of my being, corresponds with the myth of a monk. I don't live in a monastery. I think if I had been born in the medieval world, I would certainly have been a monk. I'm no less a monk now, but I live it in its modern form, and I don't take on the cliches of monasticism. I don't wear curious clothing or stick to a particular order. But still, if somebody asked me what my myth was, I would say in large part that I'm a monk, or perhaps a hermit. That doesn't mean that I'm unrelated, but it gives some idea of what you can expect from me and what you can't expect from me.
Many people have called you a mystic.
I think I would own to that title. Mysticism is an honored and hallowed term in the church. And there are people, monks and priests and desert fathers and the like, whose job is to tend that mystical portion of life. Yes, I think that is my task.